Imagine you touch down in a foreign country that you've never been to before. You leave the airport and you're surrounded by people screaming in the streets in a foreign language that you have no ability to understand. 3 months later, you arrive in a small town in that same foreign country, and you immediately begin working full-time in that country's language. How did this happen? Well, the answer is you are a Peace Corps volunteer, and you learned that language the way Peace Corps volunteers do. So I'm gonna talk about how that happens. I'm a Peace Corps volunteer, as you can see from my shirt, and I did this. And in this video, I'm gonna tell you how Peace Corps has taught literally hundreds of thousands of volunteers over 100 different languages, all in the matter of months. All right, so we have to start out with the question, what is Peace Corps? Peace Corps is an agency of the United States government that sends Americans abroad to developing countries in order to provide some skill. So it sends teachers and sanitation experts, sends people who know things about health, maternal welfare, disease prevention, a variety of environmental things like agriculture and water management, all kinds of different things. And volunteers live in generally fairly small communities outside of major cities, and they usually work in whatever the local language of that place is. I arrived in the Dominican Republic with very limited ability to understand Spanish, and now I am functionally fluent in the language. We'll say fluent imperfectly. There have been literally hundreds of thousands of volunteers that have done this exact same thing. I know many of them, and I know the Peace Corps language learning process well. So in this video, we're gonna talk about it. How do Peace Corps volunteers learn languages so well? So in Peace Corps, people speak a lot of different languages. There are some Peace Corps countries where the volunteers mostly speak English because there are English-speaking and developing countries in this world, and Peace Corps also goes to them. However, most countries are not English-speaking countries, particularly where Peace Corps operates. I'm in the Dominican Republic, which is a Spanish-speaking country with a secondary language that Peace Corps also teaches of Haitian Creole. But there are, I think, currently almost 100 current languages being taught, and over the past many 60-some years of Peace Corps, I don't know how many it is, but it's definitely over 100. So let's talk about the Peace Corps language learning process. So there's the time before you leave for the country that you're going to. There are the first 2.5 to 3 months of training, and then there is a 24-month service during which you are working. So before you leave, particularly if you're going to a country where you don't have any background, Peace Corps will sometimes provide language learning resources. This is just gonna be sort of some basic introduction to the language that you will be learning. But the real language learning starts once you arrive in country. So you arrive with your group, your cohort, and immediately within just like 1, 2, 3 days, they are assessing you in the language that you are going to be learning in. So sometimes that means that you're just going to get like a 1 out of 10 on their assessment. And sometimes that means that you're going to have some higher level because a lot of people have previous study or even have like a family background or have lived in a country that speaks that language previously. And then every single person, regardless of language level, gets placed in a language learning group, and you begin to learn the language that you are learning. In the Dominican Republic, we learned intensive Spanish study every afternoon for almost 3 months. We were put into small groups of about 3 to 6 people, and we had an individual professional Spanish teacher whose entire job it was to teach us everything that they could about that language. We would study for 4 hours every single day, and then we would go and we would try to practice that Spanish. Additionally, during pre-service training, we were living with host families. Host families are so important because you cannot learn a language fluently if you are not practicing that language. You have to practice the language over and over and over and over again, and class is just not enough time to do that, even if you are in class for 4 hours a day. So that language teacher would teach us some things, then we would go back to our host families and we would spend like 5 or 6 additional hours every morning and evening with our host family using the language. And I'm gonna be honest, when I got to my host family, I basically could not have a relationship with that host family because I did not really speak enough Spanish to have a conversation. And I mean, even if I sort of knew some Spanish vocab, I'd studied Spanish in high school or something, touch down and they're speaking this weird dialect that I've never been exposed to before. And frankly, my Spanish just wasn't that good anyway. I didn't know a lot of extremely basic words. And my host family was talking around me. And there were like 10 of them. And I literally sat on their couch in their house. And I just listened to them speak for like 6 hours every single day for 3 months. And I learned a lot. Seriously, just listening is the best thing that you can do to reinforce that language. And when I would need to talk, I would try to talk. And fortunately, people who sign up to be host families for Peace Corps volunteers are usually pretty nice, like individuals, and they know that you're a weird American who's like coming and you don't speak the language and things like that. And so my host family, and I think the host families of a lot of other people, was super like just really willing to have slow, halted, really just challenging, not super fun conversations with me about really basic things like whether I want sugar in my coffee or not, you know, like. And it was a little bit of a struggle. Honestly, it's hard. Like it's really hard to live with strangers who you can't communicate well with, but it's worth it. And I compare it to like the experience I had when I was studying abroad. I had 2 different host families when I studied abroad in Bosnia. And of my 4 host parents that I had in those 2 host families, 3 spoke English. And honestly, I really did not learn as much Bosnian as I could have because I was not forced to speak it in the same way. Like I would try to speak Bosnian with my host family, and then when I didn't know something, I would fall back on English. And they would do it too because they want to communicate with this like person that's living in their house, right? So it's not anyone's fault, but when you guys just straight up have to speak the language of the host country, you learn a lot faster. And then Peace Corps in the mornings for us, so like half the day, we also had job training. And so I'm a Spanish literacy volunteer, so I teach Spanish reading and writing to students in a school. You might be wondering like, oh, how did that girl do that if she didn't speak Spanish? Good question. I'm not sure. But I did, and now I do it a lot better than I used to. But Peace Corps taught us all the relevant vocab for like that specific job, and they made us practice in like schools in the community that we were training in before we got to our permanent communities that we were gonna stay in, and we just like figured it out. So for example, for literacy, well, you learn the basic vocab. You need to know the name of every single letter in the alphabet. You need to know how to say like reading fluency, and you need to learn how to conduct a literacy evaluation, and you need to know the word for literacy, but you don't need to know vocabulary to talk about the economy because it's not prioritized, and that's okay because like you have to just get that basic vocab in so you can start using the language. So like one thing I think Peace Corps does really well is they focus on the things you need to know. Another thing about the Peace Corps learning process is that it is about speaking and listening. It is not about reading and writing. Peace Corps' assessment is called the LPI, which is the Language Proficiency Interview, and it's on a scale from 1 to 10. And the entire assessment is an oral interview. So they are only ever going to assess you on spoken language. And that's because Peace Corps is generally working in communities where oral communication is the main mode of communication. For example, in my community, a lot of people are not literate, right? And I think that's true in a lot of Peace Corps communities. Additionally, a lot of Peace Corps countries, particularly countries in like Africa, have non-written languages or languages that are really not languages with a lot of literature and reading and writing. Obviously, Spanish is not like that. So if you do want to learn those skills, you can in Spanish, but you are going to need to do it yourself because Peace Corps is going to teach you how to speak. But like, for example, I know in Peace Corps Thailand, they don't even really teach them the Thai alphabet. Like if volunteers want to know how to read and write in Thai, they have to teach them themselves. Because what they want volunteers to be able to do is go in and speak Thai with their community, because that is how you facilitate community integration, and that's how you get better at speaking. So there is also sort of stakes to this, right? So there's external motivation and there's that really internal, like, I've got to learn this language motivation as well. Externally, you can't swear in as a Peace Corps volunteer at the end of training if you don't hit your language target. Which means that, like for Spanish, you had to already be at like an intermediate mid level. So a 5 out of 10. And if you don't hit that level, they either will not swear you in or they will make you do a lot of additional tutoring in order to get up to the level that you need to be at. But they provide a lot of really great resources to allow volunteers to continue learning throughout the course of their service, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So another thing that I think is so important about how Peace Corps volunteers learn languages is that you have to learn that language. You know that if you don't get that shit done, you're gonna be screwed. So let's talk about how humans learn languages, right? Here's some questions. In a math classroom, which student is gonna be more successful? The student who thinks the material is irrelevant to their life, or the student who thinks it's gonna be extremely important to them? Obviously, the student who thinks it's going to be extremely important to them is going to learn a lot faster. And that is true for languages too. If you're learning a language and it doesn't have anything to do with the rest of your life, you're not going to be as motivated. And so you're not going to learn as quickly. Which student is going to be better at math? The student who is constantly applying the math skills they're learning in class to the world around them, or the student who only ever thinks about math in math class? Well, obviously the student who is constantly applying those skills is going to learn a lot faster. Similarly, I literally cannot leave my house without using Spanish. And in fact, even in my house, I have people texting me in Spanish. I'm surrounded by books in Spanish. The advertisements on my phone are in Spanish. I can choose to put my phone in Spanish if I want to. And so I'm just surrounded by it constantly. And so I'm having those language learning skills reinforced nonstop. And it helps so much. Because the thing is, we know if we don't learn Spanish, we're gonna touch down and we're gonna be alone in a town, and we're gonna be surrounded by people, and they're gonna say, do a job, and we're not gonna be able to do it. And so we worked very hard for many hours a day, using Spanish 10, 12 hours a day with really real intentional study, and it works. Okay, so other things that I think go really well during pre-service training. There are also sort of active learning opportunities, like things like field trips, right? So our language learning class learned how to go buy fruit from the fruit store, right? Like the fruit stand on the street. And we learned the vocabulary for all the fruit, and then we learned how to talk about prices, and then we walked over to the fruit store and we bought fruit. Similarly, we did this with clothing. So we learned how to bargain in Spanish, and there was a whole unit about that. We learned words about bargaining, phrases you can say, how to talk about clothing, and then we went to a store that sold clothes, and we practiced doing that. And those are really, again, those are like the really functional skills that you're going to need to know. And I think it's really great to start with those sort of like skills that are really necessary from the very beginning, because it gives you a base to build upon, and it gives you the ability to start understanding what's going on right away, because you have the necessary grammar for like common conversation. So then you go off and you get to your community, your Peace Corps community, and you're there for 2 years. What happens? There's a lot of different things they do. So they give us a lot of resources. So for example, I have this textbook that I was given. It's Advanced Spanish Grammar, really helpful. They also gave us the 500 Spanish Verbs book. That is also helpful. I have all my notes. And then also there's a Peace Corps library that has a lot of books and things like that. So like, for example, right now I'm reading a book in Spanish, and things like that obviously help with language acquisition a lot. Additionally, they provide individualized tutoring to volunteers, and it depends on the country and your sort of internet situation, but either Peace Corps will pay for you to get tutored by a member of the host community who can help you continue improving your language, or they will have one of the professional language teachers that works with Peace Corps tutor you virtually, or actually even in person if you're able to go into the city to the Peace Corps office for that tutoring. So they really care a lot. And then they additionally, if you're not hitting high enough language levels throughout the course of your service, they'll bring you into the Peace Corps office for like a week, sometimes even 2 weeks, and continue to teach you like intensive 8 hours a day for an entire week of that language. And I didn't personally do that, but I know from other Peace Corps volunteers that have done that apparently that is extremely helpful. And then similarly, they'll continue to assess you throughout the course of your Peace Corps service. So you can get that LPI interview done halfway through service. In my country, it's optional. And then at the end, every single person does that. And that's sort of generally considered an acceptable exam for things like graduate school jobs, things like that. So it is nice to have that on your resume because pretty much everybody speaks the language at the end. For me, I continue to improve my Spanish dramatically. I'm the only Peace Corps volunteer that lives in my small town. I'm in a town of about 1,500 people. And the next closest American to me lives like 40 minutes away. So I don't have anybody else to speak English with. People in my town speak Spanish and they speak Haitian Creole. And there is literally not one person that I am aware of in my town who speaks fluent English. And so I just have no other choice. Again, comparing this to when I studied abroad, I mean, I was in a capital city of a European country. I was surrounded by English speakers, and there were also a lot of other exchange students around with me that I had as my closest social circle that I would spend all my time with. I was also a bad teenager, and so I would skip school and not go to school, which I obviously do not do here because this is a real job. So now I'm in my community. I'm at school like 8 hours a day, every single day, Monday through Friday. And then everybody I interact with, other than that, I'm also only interacting with in Spanish. And so in that way, I don't have those like English speaking crutches that I did the last time that I lived abroad. Oh my God, someone's screaming gringa out my window. I need them to stop. They don't even want me. They actually want my landlady because my landlady's name is Gringa. I'm Americana and she's Gringa. Let's just wait till he stops screaming. So something that I think people sometimes don't understand is that language immersion in a way can be a myth. Unfortunately, I think it's actually very common that people move to a foreign country and don't acquire that language to the intensity that they need to be acquiring that language. In order to be a good language learner while learning by immersion, you need to understand that you have to be an active participant in your language learning process. You still probably should be studying grammar. You should be studying vocabulary, and you should be going out and interacting with people in that target language as much as you possibly can. And that way you won't end up being one of these people who moves to Italy for 6 months and can't really have a real conversation in Italian. Don't be that person. Work hard. Anyway, I don't want to seem too judgy about it because I'm saying this from experience. I have been that person. I was that person in Bosnian. And now I'm not that person in Spanish, and it's because of the Peace Corps way of doing things, which is about total immersion and integration into your community. Okay, other little things. A lot of Peace Corps countries don't have very good internet. For example, at my host family in pre-service training, I had sort of okay internet. Now I am not able to do things like watch TikTok and stream videos sufficiently well in order to make it fun. And so I end up not really having as much fun on just English speaking media as I otherwise would. And that facilitates the use of Spanish in my own personal time as well. And I think that's true for a lot of Peace Corps volunteers. And then you also live with a host family when you first arrive at your permanent site for differing amount of time. In some countries, it's the entire time you're there. For me, it was the first 3 months. I think some countries have it be even less, maybe 6 weeks or something. But you do live with a host family, and that's for the purpose of community integration, but it also really facilitates language learning as well. Okay, so to summarize, how do Peace Corps volunteers learn languages so fast? I think it comes down to a couple of things. One, really intensive, high quality language instruction at the beginning of your time. Two, a focus on really functional language use. In high school, you're gonna be learning about stuff like human rights, and you're gonna be learning about how to talk about the United Nations. In Peace Corps, you're gonna learn how to buy fruit. And that's a lot more important, frankly. And you're gonna learn how to talk about the things that have to do directly with your job. The next thing, of course, is community integration and a focus on really spending a lot of time speaking in your target language. And then the fourth thing is basically ignoring reading and writing altogether. Peace Corps prioritizes speaking and listening and wants you to learn the language that way, which, there are real pros and cons to that, but it works for their purposes. And then finally, number 5 is they support us a lot with continued language learning once we go off and we're living independently, and they are no longer with us in intensive training, but they still give us a lot of opportunities to learn the target language. Anyway, so I hope that this was helpful to you. I think that there's a lot to be learned from the Peace Corps language learning process, even for people not in Peace Corps. And if you're a person who's like watching this, considering doing Peace Corps, I think that learning a second language is a really wonderful pro of Peace Corps, and you're probably going to learn that second language a lot better than you would in other situations. Not every Peace Corps volunteer learns a second language very well. There's a lot of people that go to English-speaking countries. There's a lot of people that just sort of, still give up. But I think that most do. Like, I don't know of a single Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic who has finished their 2 years of service and not been approximately fluent in Spanish. Seriously, not one. So I think it works. It's worked for me. I am now at a higher level in Spanish than I've ever been in any foreign language. I'm still learning, and I still have almost a year left. So we'll see how it goes, but I'm happy with the Peace Corps language learning process. If you do want to learn more about Peace Corps or learning languages, those are the two main things that are on this YouTube channel. I have a whole bunch of videos about Peace Corps Dominican Republic, and then I also have a bunch of videos about linguistics and language learning. So do check out some of those other videos, and I think you'll find some helpful additional information about it if you've made it to this point in the video. Like and subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you next time. Bye!